Hello and welcome to the Business of Betting podcast. Today I'm joined by Peter Sainsbury. Peter, thank you very much for coming on.
Before we get into this episode, make sure you follow us on Twitter, @BettingPod, and check out the website, businessofbetting.com. Guest suggestions are much appreciated. This podcast is proudly sponsored by Betfair Proprietary Limited. Betfair operates a betting exchange and is licensed in the Northern Territory of Australia. Residents of Australia can join Betfair by visiting betfair.com.au and support this podcast by using promo code BOBPOD. Please gamble responsibly. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Business of Betting podcast.
Today I'm joined by Peter Sainsbury. Peter, thank you very much for coming on.
Hi, Jake. Yeah, thanks for inviting me along. I'm looking forward to talking.
Peter, tell us a little bit about your background, and not only in the betting world, but you've spent a fair bit of time certainly writing about, and there's some information online about commodity markets and a few other things. So why don't you take us through your progression and then what took you from that area of the world into what we're going to talk about today and then betting on F1?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. So my background is in economics. So I trained as an economist. And, that's been my sort of day job over the last sort of 20 to 30 years. Economics is all about kind of understanding the interactions between different parts of, how people behave and how they react to events and, different things that are going on. But my primary focus, as you kind of alluded to, is about commodity markets. So that's been my real focus in terms of both my interest during the day and from an investment point of view as well. In the last 3 or 4 years, I've written a number of books, particularly really to kind of help investors understand commodity markets in more detail and try and take away some of the kind of illusion that it's a market for sort of widows and orphans, and that they shouldn't try and get involved in the sector. So that's been really, really useful. But I think from a betting point of view, I've been involved primarily in betting on Formula One for sort of 20 odd years now. It's a sport that I've followed since I was maybe sort of 4 or 5 years old. I can recall actually watching a race, and I'd perhaps love to sort of tell you a story that I was kind of betting on Formula One from primary school, but that certainly wasn't the case. It was probably when I got to about 18 or 19, I became involved. Became really interested in it from a probability kind of point of view, and trying to understand the interactions between different teams and drivers, and really try and understand where I could capture some value in the markets.
How valuable and useful is your training as an economist, and I think looking at different markets, for example, has a lot of that helped you when you're transitioning over towards Formula One betting?
Yeah, I think it's worked in both directions, really, in terms of thinking about things from a probabilistic point of view, and then working the other way and trying to understand if A happens, what does that mean for B, and what could that mean for other drivers, other teams in the sport. So it's really about sort of taking that kind of sort of second level thinking, understanding that different events have much wider implications. And I think it's for me, it's really been those kind of insights that have allowed me to progress in betting on Formula One and keep it be as sustainable as it has over the last 2 decades.
What was it like in the 90s betting on Formula One races?
Yeah, it was. I think it's probably really been in the last sort of 10 to 15 years where it's become more professional from, the bookmakers are certainly much more on top of their game now than they were back in the late 90s and early 2000s. If you just understood the very basic rules, there were massive opportunities available, and a lot of the markets weren't necessarily available on the internet back in those days, and if you had some insight into how one team was performing relative to another, that could open up really big opportunities. I think perhaps the best example was every season the teams do what's called winter testing. So they roll out their new cars in sort of February, March every year, and then spend 2 weeks in Barcelona, testing those cars and seeing how they perform. But going back 20 odd years ago, that information just wasn't getting out. If you knew who to talk to, who had an insight into how teams were performing, you could really get some really good information on how the teams were going to perform over the season.
So take us through some of the betting market offerings that are available and which ones you focus in on. I would imagine the higher volume ones are more important from your perspective.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, from a high volume point of view, the actual winners market for each individual race definitely has the highest volume. It's traded. Certainly one of the biggest markets that's traded in running during the race. I think the other markets that are available, there's markets on who wins or who's fastest in each individual practice session. Who's fastest during qualifying. But I think some of the interesting value you can start to get is by focusing away from the front of the field. Other bettors and the bookmakers tend to focus on the battle for who's going to win the race, who's going to be on the podium. But I think there's much less focus on who's going to be who's going to be able to get into sixth place or who's going to be able to get into the back end of the points. And so you often get markets on kind of group betting and match betting, where the bookmakers just haven't priced it up correctly. They haven't understood how the underlying performance of the teams and drivers is likely to evolve over the weekend. And I think those are probably the most interesting markets that there are.
How do you split your time? Are you betting mainly in play, or do you still spend a lot of time before the race and betting on different markets before they start?
I think it's primarily bets placed before the start, or in the days leading up to the Grand Prix. I think what's important really is to kind of I analyze the performance of the drivers and the teams by looking at how they're paced, how the teams have performed on strategy, how reliable the cars have been, the relative performance of different teammates, and then I look at how their recent performance is, but also looking at what's happened in previous races at that particular venue. And so you often find that one particular driver or a particular team tend to outperform at certain races. And just this weekend coming, Lewis Hamilton in the Mercedes team has got a very good track record there. He tends to outperform where he does performs normally. And then as the weekend evolves, you get practice on Friday and Saturday morning. And that's a really useful way of capturing more information. And I think it's important to understand it's not just about who has the fastest overall time. It's, understanding the long run pace. Drivers do, test their cars for, several laps or more, and that can give you a really good indication of, the underlying pace in the car. And then you got, qualifying, which sets the grid for the race. And throughout, all of this, you're kind of, adjusting your model of how drivers and teams are performing and what you expect from the race. So it's kind of an iterative process, and kind of building that up to the start of the race.
How dynamic is that period between, let's say, like Tuesday or Wednesday, all the way through some of the testing and the Thursday, Friday, Saturday sessions, and then to the race?
Yeah, it certainly varies by the track. I think is probably the key variable. If you for a circuit like say Monaco, it's a street circuit. What drivers and teams like to see is they gradually ramp up the speed during the weekend, so you've got more and more confidence building up. But what you don't want to see happen is a driver putting it in the wall on Friday and then losing all that time and data to help prepare for the race, or if there's a lot of rain on the Friday and the rest of the weekend's due to be dry, teams and the drivers have got a real sort of blank sheet of what that they expect from the race. So I think the answer is it varies dramatically depending on the circuit and the weather conditions and other factors like that. And so what can be interesting is when you've got that kind of disruptive session, it's really sort of focusing then on the potential for those teams and drivers that you wouldn't normally expect to be performing towards the front. It can open up some real possibilities and real big opportunities.
So there's something like, I think, 15 races on the year or the season or around that number. Is that enough for you to bet on? Would you love there to be 30 races or one every weekend or 2 a week? What's an optimal amount of races to bet on?
That's right. It was around the number of races over the season has gradually grown over the last 20 years. It used to be around 15 or 16, and now it's 20 or 21. In an ideal world, I would be. It'd be great if this was Formula One was on every weekend. I'm not sure my family would agree with me, but it would certainly make more interesting times for me. And I think the important point perhaps is that I do a lot of research to understand how teams and drivers are performing, and trying to capture as much value as I can from these races. But because there's only so few races during the year, I think you've got to be very careful about how much kind of you don't want to get too confident about your what you expect to happen. Because there's so few distinct events over the year. You only need, you could be incredibly confident with one particular driver, and have got, it could be a massive price, but you only need another car to, outbrake itself and crash into the back of it for that to go, literally go up in smoke. So I think that it's about, because Formula One's a dynamic sport where you've got 20 drivers, charging around a circuit. They're all jostling for position especially on the first lap. They're having to overtake each other, overtake back markers during the race, and all those individual events mean that your carefully laid bets, your carefully laid vision of what the sport, the race is how it's going to unfold, can go completely pear-shaped sometimes.
Take me through the differences you might have noticed recently with the change, and certainly the allowing of advertising, for example, in Formula One, and I guess that overall shape, because obviously a lot of sports are pushing back more than leaning in towards gambling and sports betting and advertising and some of those things.
Yeah.
How has that changed this year, and I guess what do you expect it to, or what impact will it have in the coming years?
Yeah, that's right. So the sport has always been, up until very recently, owned and run by really the man that founded it, a guy called Bernie Ecclestone, and he was pretty much quite anti betting advertising involved in the sport. He was quite happy for a while for it to be tobacco and alcohol, but betting was for whatever reason too much of a leap. But in recent years, the new owners of the sport, a company called Liberty, have been much more open to the sort of the commercial opportunities that betting advertising and more kind of insights from a probability kind of point of view would bring. So this year there's a team called Racing Point, and they're sponsored by a company called Sporting Payser, who are a betting company, and I think it's difficult to know at this time whether there's perhaps more volume in the market or more markets, but certainly think of it from a UK bookmaker perspective, there's certainly a lot of competition in the sector. So there's I think relative to where it was maybe 5 years ago, there's a lot of bookmakers getting involved in the sport, which is good. You've got lots of competition in terms of the range of markets that are being offered, and also the prices on offer as well. I think the other point to mention is Formula One's push into America. So there's been a race in Texas since I think about 2012, but there's a potential for another one in Miami in the next maybe 2 or 3 years. So I think if Formula One pushes further into that market, now that betting's on the road at least to more deregulation, then I think that will be a big potential opportunity for Formula One and for people like me as well.
So tell me, especially with your background, about the betting markets and I guess some of the efficiency or how they've evolved over the last decade or so. Have you noticed that things have tightened up a fair bit, or is there still plenty of information to gather and bets to place if you're doing things in a coordinated manner and targeting the right areas?
The markets are certainly more efficient than they were. But I think what's interesting about Formula One, I think relative to other sports, is that the rules keep changing all the time. So unlike say football, horse racing, or golf, the actual the playing field, as it were, keeps changing every year. They don't want one team dominating each and every year and that carrying on into the future. So every year, the sports governing body changes the rules effectively, so it makes it more difficult for teams to compete. There's a constant striving forward to more innovation, and I think from my perspective, it's really trying to understand how teams are likely to perform under those different rules, and that throws up new opportunities. So it's you do get markets becoming more efficient, but then as the rules change, those inefficiencies start to be reintroduced into the betting markets.
So tell me about the betting process with different bookmakers. How many different bookmakers can you if I started betting on Formula One today and I needed to have different accounts, am I able to bet at 5, 10, 15 or less or more? Is there an exchange option? Are they looking at cutting down bet sizes for those that are doing well in Formula One? Tell us a little bit about your experience in that space.
Yeah, I think there's there's certainly from in the UK there's about say 15, maybe even more actually, but bookmakers that frequently offer at least a limited range of markets on each Formula One race. There are probably a handful or more that are very, very they offer a very sort of comprehensive range of markets, and they do that for every individual session during the weekend, and they've been consistent over time as well. So I think there's definitely lots of interest there. Certainly on the exchanges as well. Betfair and I think a few others offer a range of markets that you can trade during individual sessions as well. And I think the answer about how much money you can place with bookmakers, I think we're at the point at the moment in the UK where there's so much competition on in terms of Formula One from the bookmakers that that's not necessarily been too much of a problem so far. So I think it's quite an interesting market at the moment.
And what about high volume exchanges, or certainly in play? I'm interested if are you sitting on the computer with a couple of screens open watching the event and trading in that sense of the word, or is it pretty much the bookmakers that you're targeting?
Yeah, I think it's primarily, I think it's a balance between the two really. Leading up to the weekend, it's a lot really to the bookmakers, but towards when the race is starting and through the race, I've got perhaps Betfair up, and you can access the live timing for the race, so you can understand where drivers sit relative to each other, how they're performing second by second. I think the thing you've got to be aware of with Formula One on TV, I think like a lot of sports, is that there is tends to be a lag between the pictures you see on TV and the actual what's actually happening. So that's that can be relevant to Formula One in particular. If a car has crashed out, there's no, that gives you very limited time to react and pull your funds out.
So tell me about the analytics side of this and what information you can use to evaluate performance and I guess derive probabilities so that you can hopefully place, plus EV bets.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier on there's, every race there is a number of practice sessions where the teams and drivers can, test their cars, test the setups for the race. So all that data is publicly available. You can download lap by lap information. I think what's useful is both understanding the fastest lap that people produce, a driver does, but also the long run times. Understanding how they're likely to perform during the race. I think where it becomes very difficult is in recent years the sport has introduced the tyres that they degrade a lot faster than that was in the sport a few years ago. So you've really got to understand how what at individual points what teams what tyres were they using. If it was just a very short number of laps, does that indicate that they were very light on fuel? If they've done a long run, does that mean they're heavy on fuel? And it's kind of just to tease apart those kind of that sort of context behind it, and it's really only by doing that you can really kind of understand the state of play between different drivers.
Has that been predictable? If you do all the work and you tease out those different elements, has it been something that you can find out which direction it might take? Because I know in basketball, for example, I think at college level they changed the shot clock time, and in NFL there was different rule changes with respect to different flags and penalties and things like that. And it wasn't always 100% clear if that would be good for scoring or bad for scoring or different elements. In Formula One, have you found that it's been something that you can essentially pinpoint what the outcomes might lead to?
I think it's all about you can't necessarily predict what's going to happen. There's too many other variables that the impact on the weekend. How a driver and team are going to perform. But you can often find things, sort of glaring differences in performance that just aren't reflected in the market. And it's really those kind of instances that I look out for. Where there's something is being completely mispriced, and that's what I look for.
How much of your process is gut feeling and watching the race and then making a split-second judgment on what you're seeing versus putting all the information, the lap time, and all the other data into a computerized model?
Yeah, I think as you move through from where through a couple of days before the weekend, and as you go through, a lot of it's more kind of model driven, understanding the data and the evidence that you've got. But as it gets through individual sessions, through qualifying in a race, I've got such a big bank of knowledge and experience by watching so many races, and then really sort of after every race teasing it apart, understanding why something happened, why something else didn't happen, why didn't one particular driver perform as expected or as good as his teammate? And it's only really by having that sort of level of knowledge that you can then start to get those sort of gut reactions and instinctive bets during the race.
So I want to talk about the books again. We touched on some of the commodity stuff earlier on, but what drove you to write a book about Formula One?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. As you said, I'd read I wrote and published a couple of books on commodity markets about trying to help investors in the sector. And part of the reason by writing a book about Formula One betting was to do the same thing for people who would be interested in betting on Formula One. Other people who've been betting on other sports, but also people who have an interest in Formula One, but are interested in getting into it from a betting point of view. I think the other kind of point was that it goes back to kind of our conversation. Really, it was a kind of a way of sort of formalizing my my playbook, as you like, for betting on Formula One. It's something I've developed over the years, but I haven't. Up until recently, I hadn't actually put it on paper as to why I think the way I do, how I approach the weekend. So I think it is, both to help other people, but also it's been a useful process for me, really, in trying to get some structure and being able to move on from where I have been.
In such a relatively small or niche marketplace, were you worried that it might impact those markets, or if enough people got their hands on the book and implemented some of the things, that it might have an impact on your business? Yeah,
that's always there's always the potential for that to happen. But no, I think it's about you only kind of move forward and improve if you share your ideas and share your process. It's only from doing that you can iterate that and improve. So I hope people take on board some of the insights that I've detailed in the book. And they're very willing, very your listeners are certainly able to get in touch with me, and we can have a conversation, and that'd be really good.
So I want to also ask about a bit of a different topic, and just essentially decision making and your process for making better decisions, and how you manage some of the emotions, the passions, and all that goes with it. Have you sort of built a framework around what you can do to try and help your process within all of that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've touched on it to an extent already, just thinking about the sort of mental models in terms of making decisions. So thinking from things from a inside. Most people think of things from like an inside point of view. So recent form suggests this driver is gonna win the race. They've won the last couple of races. But taking it from an outside view, you might look at what's happened in recent previous years at that event. What are the underlying weather conditions that mean that another driver might perform better than what the recent form suggests. Thinking things from a kind of sort of second level thinking perspective. And I think one example that came up in the last few races was at the race in Azerbaijan. So there was it's very much a fast street circuit where during the course of the weekend, a lot of drivers had accidents. They crashed into the barriers, and the market for whether there was going to be a safety car. So a safety car comes out if there's an accident or there's a debris on the circuit that means they need to kind of sort of neutralize the race and slow people down. But what happened was that the market, the drivers reacted to that level of sort of damage during the build up to the session. So their behaviour was a lot more sort of better behaved during the race. So they actually drove perhaps more responsibly than they would have done normally. So you could kind of appreciate that they'd react to those events and be more responsible during the race. And I think we touched on the limited number of races during the season, and that you need to kind of control your risk appetite during the races. That's I think that's a key concern. But what I've introduced to my own process, and that's kind of something I've developed from investing and trading in commodities, is a decision journal. So before, this doesn't necessarily apply to in trade betting, but certainly any bets that I place before the weekend and before the race, I document my decision making process before actually placing it. So kind of what's my rationale for backing that particular outcome. How much value do I see in the price that's being offered, and then I kind of detail what would need to change for me to know that was the wrong decision. When would I want to come out of that trade or out of that bet? And I always find that's best to do that when you're at your least emotional and you're most rational, and that tends to be before you've actually placed that bet.
How has that impacted your overall P&L, or just your overall betting or overall process? Has it been really positive, or how do you avoid just going straight to the outcome and saying whether it was good or bad based on the outcome rather than the general process?
Well, I think what it's allowed me to do is to look back, after the race, but over the course of the season, and I can see whether it's a win or a loss. I can see my rationale for making a particular bet or a particular trade, and irrespective of the outcome, if the rationale is sound, if I've I've identified based on my framework of understanding and my you know perception of risk and value in the market, that what the bet or trade I've done was the right decision at the time, then I can use that information to keep improving my process. So I think it's been useful from a P&L perspective, but it's also been very useful from a kind of that emotional kind of sort of mind management during the season.
Tell me, have you looked at betting on other motorsports, for example, that might have similarities, or even ball sports? Have you thought about how that might play out?
Yeah, well, I mean, the other motorsport that I do sometimes get involved with is Formula E, and so it's very similar to Formula One, but it's electric vehicles, and that's only say about 5 years old now. It's much more limited in terms of betting markets. Much more unpredictable. The cars are typically, there's very little to differentiate between them. So the ability of the driver has a much bigger influence on the outcome. But I think that's something that's I'm starting to get my teeth into a bit more. The betting markets are quite limited at the moment, but I think as it becomes a bit more popular, hopefully that will develop in the next couple of years. I don't necessarily follow other sports to the level I do Formula One, so it's I don't necessarily see it sort of crossing over to other sports, but that may happen in the future.
So not many people have been following Formula One for a couple of decades. What advice would you have for those interested in it and might be looking at it from a betting perspective and moving forward might want to get involved in the Formula One betting marketplace?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great sport to follow. It's great. I think the betting markets are very interesting. I think it's some great opportunities there. If any of your listeners or anyone else perhaps don't come from a betting perspective or a betting background, and they've always just followed the sport, I think I'd always perhaps just caution that your sort of specialist knowledge of any domain, and also Formula One isn't necessarily going to translate into being able to succeed at it from a betting perspective. It's as in all betting or investing or trading, it's all about finding value, and not necessarily about getting the prediction exactly right. So I think that's probably the main lesson I want people to take away. But also really that's I mentioned earlier on, really luck can play a big part in the outcome in any particular race. So I think it's as you learn more about sport, you can appreciate where those chance events are more likely to happen. So wet races, where the practice leading up to the race has been disrupted, the form guide is likely to be overturned in there's more chance of that happening. But yeah, and I think overall it's an exciting sport and betting market to be involved in, and I think it's going to be got a lot of potential for growth in the future.
I have one final question about how you spend some of your time from a non-day-to-day perspective, where you're digging into the information and the models and betting. How do you spend your research hours or some of your spare time? Are you looking at investing, or are you focusing in on betting, or do you spend time reading about economics? What areas do you focus on to help augment what you're doing on the betting side?
Yeah, well, I think it's what I try and do is read as widely as possible. So not just about Formula One, not just about betting, and not just necessarily about investing or economics. It's about trying to take aspects from lots of different fields, and I think it's only really by kind of sort of bringing that together that you can, get an edge. So we've talked about, lessons in sort of decision making and kind of managing emotions, and those are things that I've kind of taken from, really taking at things from a very different angle. And so, that's where I kind of enjoy, sort of spending the other hours that I have available.
So, Peter, I want to make sure that those interested in the book can get a little understanding of what they can expect. So do you mind just running us through the blurb or what they can expect, and also where they can find you on social media or even the website? I think it's materialsrisk.com.
Yeah, that's right. So the book is called The Winning Formula, Betting on Formula One. It's available on Amazon as an ebook. And the book is written, I think, on sort of two different levels. It kind of introduces Formula One to a relative novice to the sport, but also, for someone who's got a good grasp of betting, takes you through, the different parts of the race weekend, what you need to think about at different times during the weekend, how to think about trading during the race or different sessions over the weekend, what to think about in terms of data, so the amount of information that you can capture, where you can get it, how to interpret it, and as we've talked about today, the type of different markets that are available, and where and in what circumstances you can look for the best value. The best place to contact me on Twitter is at betonformula1, and my website, which is primarily focused on commodities, is materials-risk.com.
Perfect, Peter. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. I think we got Canada coming up next, and then on to France. So best of luck with the betting, and best of luck with the book, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed it, Jake. Thanks very much.